Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the next video in which we continue to talk about the human resources parameters. And in this video, we're going to go back into the human resource parameter and talk a little bit about number sequence. So this is the home page, and you must have seen the home page for finance and operation quite some time as you have been maybe following the videos for human resources. So we're going to continue to talk about the configuration, the setup, and then at some point we're going to use the uh, end user's point of view, the way they would execute tasks. So right now we're actually configuring the system. We're going to start talking about how you configure the system. So if you go into human resources, go into the setup, right underneath the setup, this is human resources parameters. So if you don't recall what the difference between human resource parameters and human resource shared parameters, you might want to look into the previous videos where I have actually talked about the difference. It's really helpful to know that just because the naming convention is being used throughout finance and operation. So human resource parameters, as you go into it, we talked about general recruitment and compensation. So today we're going to discuss number sequences. And number sequences is universal in a way when you configure it. So if you understand how to configure number sequence in the human resource parameters, you can easily configure the number sequences in accounts payable or accounts receivable, even procurement and sourcing. So we'll probably see that as we start touching those at some point down in the future. But today, it's very easy to navigate into number sequences and be able to configure it. So let's go in a bit more detail and see how you can configure. So in the reference field, you'll get to see quite a few depending on which module you're in. So in human resources, remember this is human resource parameters, so it's only applicable to this BRMF legal entity. And these are the only number sequence that are applicable to this legal entity. So if you go into the shared parameters, you may see a different list there. So in the references, we have application, absence registration, course ID, agenda, compensation process result, case number, and whatnot. So all of these are applicable to different processes within the system. So like application actually has to do with when you are creating a part or configuring the recruitment projects, for instance. So this is taking the application ID, the number sequence that you configure. Absence registration is to do with the leave of absence. Course ID is to do with the training and courses. So if you start creating courses within the system, start assigning them, then this number sequence is being kicked in terms of agenda. So that's the same thing with the courses. So when you create courses, you have a unique key for agenda. So you can create agenda for those courses as well. Compensation process results. We'll talk a little bit about that. This is very applicable to the compensation. The case number, that has to do with the injuries that we talked about. So under general, we talked about in one of the videos where we do illness and case injuries for contractors and construction workers, for instance. So there are quite a few injuries that happen on site. So case number is the number sequence that is being picked up for that. Leave ID request, it belongs to the leave of absence. So if an employee is requesting a leave from the employee self-service workspace or this is the number sequence that comes in. Not something relevant, but it's always obviously good to configure when you actually have leave of absence and if you're integrating with the payroll system. Buy and sell request ID. So that's a new feature that came in a while back. So now you have the ability to either buy or sell your leave request depending on the organization's policies. And then recruiting request ID and candidate ID is very self-intuitive. It has to do with the recruitment. So let's go into the application. So we'll take that as an example for number sequence code. So if you right click just beside the arrow pointing down, and you'll see quite a few tabs show up, or you could say the drop down menu shows up as you click on it and go into view details. So this is the shortcut to get into configuring the number sequences. There's a long way also to go through it, which you can do, I believe, through organization administration if you can find it. And there you go, so it's number sequences there. So this is a longer way where you actually have to go into the full list of number sequences and filter out the one that you need to configure. But I usually like to just go into the setup of that module itself and then configure it. So this is the main page where you would configure the number sequences. So number sequence code you would have to enter. So if I were to create a new one, it would ask me to put in the number sequence code and the name for it. Obviously, you want to make sure it's most relevant to the number sequence you're creating. So this is the dummy data that's already available. So hum65 or huma67 doesn't really make sense. So what you want to do is make sure that when you're creating these number sequences, it is very relevant the to the process, or it's applicable to what you're actually configuring. And of course, your client would have to sign off on these number sequence, so they should be the one that, telling you this information. Scope parameter, of course, is going to be company, so it's company specific because we were in the human resource parameter, not a shared parameter. So this is always going to be company specific. Segments is where you actually create the format. So you could see the format as you start configuring it, as you start adding new segments to it. This will get updated accordingly. So if I do a drop down, there are only three drop down menus that you can choose from, and then you can create multiple combinations accordingly, depending on the need of the client. So for a lot of clients, they like to have some number sequences associated with their legal entity, if they have too many legal entities, of course. And sometimes, of course, when it's a shared parameter or like a shared number sequence across, you want to make sure that you know which legal entity this number sequence is coming from for that table. So quite a few companies actually like to do that. So company specific you can make, and then write the company, the constant, so you can have a dash in between, as you could see right here in the middle, and then alphanumeric, so how many digits you want after that. And then you want to make sure that you specify it as this, otherwise it won't get accepted. So this is how you would configure. So if you were to create an application, I think that's what we were talking about. So you would say BRMF, and then we'll see what the number sequences are at the bottom. So it'll generate that number, and every time you create a new one, it'll go increment one by one, or you can make it even increment by 5, 2, or however much you want. So it really depends on the client. So make sure you ask for that. References, this is the most crucial part, of course. Once you've configured the number sequence up top, which is acceptable, you want to make sure you tie it down to, or link it to a applicable process or number sequence that you're looking at. So in this case, when you add, click on add, and you need to create a reference for it. So select the reference that you are creating this for. In this case, if I were to go into, let's see, we were looking at human resources, and of course I can't select the same one again, just because it will give me an error. And for me to do or assign this number sequence to something else will also give me an error, because I cannot assign it. I have to delete the old one that already exists at the back, and then I should be able to assign it. So in this case, we link the area with human resource because we are already in human resource, and then application is the one that this will be linked to, and then you press OK. So for now, I'll just leave it as is. And the last set is the general. So let's talk about this toggle button a little bit. In use, basically you can't use this toggle button, or you can't turn it on unless you assign it. So once you have this assigned to like an application, for instance, and when you start creating data, it turns automatically, so it becomes in use. So when you go into this number sequence and you see if it's in use, that means that it is being used somewhere, of course, and then your references what it will tell you where it's being used. And stopped. So this is, you could manually create or turn on the toggle button. In this case, I want to completely stop this being used, so I can do that within the system. And then I'll create a new one, and then of course I'll assign it to application. Manual, this is something that of course that you don't want to do, just because you will have a problem with audit. And if the audit team comes in, they want to audit every single thing that the organization has been doing, and then if the number sequence is manual, they input it manually, of course, you will run into trouble. So from an audit perspective, you want to make sure that there are no numbers being missed in between. Otherwise, you will have a problem with the audit teams. And continuous, so that's something that is mostly used for finance and accounting, for instance. So I'll give you an example how I like to understand what this continuous button does. So in this case, it's basically recycling the numbers. So for instance, if I use this continuous under a employee ID, like a personnel ID, so I create an employee and automatically a number is generated. Uh, let's call it employee one, EMP01, for instance. But I decide to not create that record, for instance. And at that point, instead of hiring that employee record, I press cancel. I don't create that record. And then I go into human resources again and I select create a new record. The next number is going to be EMP02. And then if I were to cancel that, then the next number is going to be EMP03. However, if this continuous is turned on, at some point, EMP01 is going to show up again because that one hasn't been used, so it's going to recycle. And then we can use EMP01 or 02 at some point, depending on how fast the batch jobs are running at the backend. I wouldn't advise you to use this for number sequences that are associated with like human resource, for instance, because I have advised against my clients, but they wanted to use it and they have run into quite a bit of trouble because a lot of times the number sequence is not regenerating as quickly as they would like to. And that way, the employee 01, for instance, would show up when you create a new record, like the number sequence EMP01 would show up. And it turns out that it's being used already. And then you won't be able to create a new record. In order to avoid that, for instance, you would have to do a manual cleanup, unfortunately. And that's why I say that we shouldn't be using this continuous one. It makes sense for finance and accounting to be using this, and then we create a bad job so we can maintain that performance of the plan or of the actual system. But for the ones that we don't need to use, such a scenario, we shouldn't be advising clients to use this. But if you go into manual cleanup, for instance, if you click all, you could probably see the ones that are being used, and that's where you see that there's quite a few problems. If I run to this bad job, then it's probably going to end up giving me the list. But let's see, status list should have it. Okay, so no, we don't have anything here. That's a good thing. You would see the number sequence codes that are being used and which user had ended up generating it. And then you just have to clean this up every time you want to reuse those numbers. So the continuous is not something that I would advise. And the last piece is the smallest to the largest. So the very first time when we turn this on, the number sequence, the numbers would be 01. So in this case, it will be, if I go to BRMF-00001, and then the highest number is 99,999. And then it's being incremented by 1. So this is where you can increment and skip numbers. So if I were to put 2, then it will be BRMF 003, for instance. It wouldn't be incremented by 1, but it would be incrementing by 2. So that's how you configure number sequence, and it's the same way you create a number sequence for across all the modules that are applicable here. Just as a side note, if you have stumbled upon this video to learn about human resource parameters, I started offering some guidance to review resumes and to build resumes, and I'm more than happy to give you that guidance. And I'll drop the link in the description to have you get into this space if you're really interested, and I'll provide some guidance on how you can do that. So for now, I will close this, and then we're going to start talking about employee self-service and manager self-service workspace in the next video.